Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm. I will be one of your hosts. And once again, we have my good friend, Doug Heagren. Hey, Doug.
Good morning, Kirk. Happy Friday to you. How you doing today? Inside joke there, a little laughter, but it's a pleasure to be back again this week.
Yes, I got your name right. So, and we also have our very own Kelly Coughlin. Hey, Kelly.
Hello, boys. How you doing?
Good. Well, we
Excellent.
have Kelly on this week for our tax tip of the week for all of those you have to file taxes, which is all of you. Kelly, what do you got for us this week?
Well, thanks for inviting me again. It's always a pleasure. I want to first state that none of the tax tips that we talk about on the show is considered to be advice from me to you or your audience. I don't know you, and of course, how could I possibly give you tax advice? So if you want specific tax advice, tax planning, or simply filing a return, talk to a tax professional, or heck, give me a call. And I'm pulling out my contact thing there. Look at that. Kelly, the tax guy.
Kelly with a paddle.
Kelly
All right.
with the paddle.
What
All right.
do you got for us, Kelly?
Here's what I have today. So I thought for today's tax tip, we talked very briefly about the great migration that's happening. And I'm not talking about ducks or wildebeest or butterflies. I'm talking about the migration from certain states to other states. I'm going to try not to pick on any states. We all know who they are: New York, New Jersey, Minnesota, Doug, where you are. And there's this migration going on, and there's three things that are triggering it. And I have my handy dandy paddle for this. Can you see this? This is my artwork.
Hey,
So
Kelly,
you got-
can I guess the three things that are affecting it are T, A, and X? Oh,
Well, you got 1/3 of them.
okay.
The first one is weather. That's snow cloud there. Okay. The second one is a dead body. That would be crime. And the third one is tax. Okay. Those are the three macro things that are going on. Right. Weather, that's always been the case. Dead bodies, a lot of crime in some of these northern states. Minnesota, California. Anyway, we're not going to pick on any states. And then, of course, the tax. So this migration is going on, and it kind of goes like this. It's the high tax states. You see those: California, New Jersey, Oregon, Minnesota, New York, and New Jersey. Those are kind of the sample ones. And they're going to, I tried to draw the lines connecting it. Californians tending to go to Texas, New Jersey going down to, or what's that second one there? New Jersey, Oregon. New Jersey's going to Texas and Florida. Minnesota. They
San
go to
Diego?
Florida.
Is that what the SD stands for?
No, South Dakota.
Well, that's not going to help with the weather.
No, it doesn't help with the weather, but it's closer. The biggest disincentive for people to move is family, right? It's always been business,
Especially up here.
and family. Yeah. And so those are two big disincentives. The money part, where can I work, and the tax related to that. And so that's the thing that's going on here. And so what I'm going to talk about briefly, I'm going to take a sample of a guy. I was doing his tax return last night, and Doug had been pushing me to, or Kirk's been pushing me, I should say, to come up with real life stories. Well, this is a real life story, straight off the press from a tax return I did last night for a client of mine I've had for 5 years. I'll just give you a little bit of the facts on this. He was out in California 5-6 years ago. He was a finance guy, generated 1099 income from insurance contracts, right? Commissions on that. Financial advisor, had clients all over the place. Didn't require people to come into the office, but did work remotely, right? So he got into some tax debt issues back 4 or 5 years ago. And as part of the planning to get out of that, we resolved that. We said, hey, his name wasn't Joe, so I'm going to say Joe. Joe, let's not repeat this story, right? So what can we do? Well, he had a couple things that were in his favor. One was he worked digitally and not bricks and mortar. Okay. He didn't require an in-person sale. All right. That's helpful. And his kids were pretty much raised, right? It's hard to do this strategy if you've got kids in the house that are going to the school, or you have a hockey rink in the backyard, Kirk, that you need to be there, right? But for a certain type of situation, then what we did with Joe, we developed a plan he wanted to go to Florida. He rented a home in Florida. We did this slower transition. He got a driver's license down in Florida. And we set up an S corporation for a couple of reasons. We decided to set up an S corporation. He was making about $200,000, I think, that year when we started this plan, and his business took off. That's a whole other story that's interesting. But he finished his tax return. I looked at it. He generated $1.25 million in gross revenue, netted about $750 last year. He crushed it, and because he didn't have to pay California tax, he ended up saving, we figured, about $75,000. And it's a case study in if you can get things aligned. I've never been one to say let tax drive business decisions, and certainly not personal decisions, where you live, where you want to raise your kids and all that. But if you see the things going on in the world, in your world, crime's going up, you're tired of the weather. I've got a home in Minnesota. I'm tired of Minnesota winter. That's why I'm down here in Florida. My kids are raised. I did this myself, restructured it and saved money, helped many of my clients do that. If things can line up for you, relocate. I know the states don't like me saying that, Kirk, so I'm sure Elizabeth Warren up in Massachusetts, where you are, won't appreciate this kind of comment, but it is what it is. If you can structure it personally, it can be a very, very smart move. Taxes consume about 60% of your wealth, your lifetime wealth, 30 to 60%. If you're in a low tax state, it's about 30% of your wealth, 35%. If you're in a high tax state, it's 60%. So you do the numbers on that delta of 30%, that's a big number. And it can be done, and it can be done practically. It takes a little bit of planning and that kind of thing. But that's my tip for the day.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. Really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your wisdom with us. And we'll make sure you come on next week and bring some of your wisdom back, as I'm sure there'll be plenty to talk about when it comes to tax. So,
okay. All right. Take
Great.
care. Peace out.
See ya.
Yep.
All right. Well,
I just want to comment, because we've gotten a couple comments that have come in here from Karen, and I think you bring up a good point. This obviously, as Kelly was saying, isn't for everybody's advice. There's a lot of reasons to live where people live. Family is one of the things that he had mentioned is a big reason that a lot of people, even as much as I may hear them complain about the Minnesota weather, they stay here. They don't leave. Obviously, depending on demographic, depending on situation, a place may be more or less favorable for you. I mean, Minnesota, a lot of taxes, a lot of support, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of things that people claim. I mean, Minnesota, I don't know if it's still the case, but it was a state where if you were under $30,000, or I think it was $65,000 in income a couple of years ago, the state actually provided free healthcare for your kids. So, I mean, again, this isn't one or the other. This isn't a political left or right, but there is a huge impact of taxation, and what people do see is the cost they pay in taxes. What they don't see is the opportunity cost. For every dollar you pay in tax, that's a dollar you can't invest and have for your future. There is more than every $10,000 you pay in taxes, that may end up being $30,000 or $40,000 of future wealth gone. So there's a balance there. Everybody's situation's different. I will say about California, he didn't mention it, but I just saw an article, Kirk, $500,000, I think, $500,000 to $600,000 net loss of population last year from California. So there obviously are people that are leaving it. And you're right. I lived in Texas before I moved back up here to Minnesota. A lot of people who have left California due to job relocation and other such to go to a place like Texas. And yeah, opportunity cost versus quality of life. Like I said, depends on your quality of life and what you're looking for. Everybody has a different situation. So anyway, Karen, I really appreciate the feedback that we're getting here through LinkedIn. So if anybody else has any questions or comments, please don't be shy.
Yeah, and to take that point, I mean, Kelly made a good comment, and certainly Karen's making some good comments here, is that, you can't let the tax tail wag the investment dog, or in this case, the overlay is very similar. And everybody I know that lives in California, I always ask the question, why the heck do you live there? You got homelessness, you've got bad air quality because of, fires, you've got earthquakes, you've got you've got so much stuff, crime. And it always comes back, yeah, but the weather's really good. It's like, that weather must be phenomenal. I haven't been there in a while, but it must be really good.
Kirk, if you take away all the other stuff, California has everything. Well, what do people love? They love mountains. They love dry weather. They love oceans. They love beaches. They like warmth. I mean, you just take that. There's a reason everybody's moved to California. It is an incredibly wonderful place to live. From what it offers, basically a snapshot of the entire country's, geographical, quality of life all in one place. But again, there's give and take on everything, and some things are going to be better for certain people, and some things are not going to be as favorable to certain people, and to everybody's own situation.
So I think I think what matters, at least from what I see, right, and everyone. So it's kind of like buying a house, right? You buy a house. Is it a good investment decision? Maybe yes, maybe no. But it's a personal expense, right? You buy a house, you buy it because it makes you feel good. It's exactly what you want. Are you overpaying? Maybe. I don't know. But you don't. It's only one of the decisions. Finances are only one of the decisions. One of the other decisions is the emotional decision. Oh, I really like the tree in the backyard. I'd love to have a swing on there that my kids could go on it. Whatever it is, right? It doesn't have to be rational. That's the point, right? So, when you look at these states, and Kelly makes a great point, and I was laughing a little bit because he had New Jersey up there twice. So immediately I thought, does that mean New Jersey has twice as many bad taxes? Because it's on there twice. But
it's
anyway,
Jersey. They got twice as many everything.
They got problems, yeah. So, but anyway, my yeah, New Jersey's the highest in the U.S. Kelly's saying, yeah, that's very true. So, I guess the point is, if you look at this exodus of people from certain states, there's certain states that are seeing a mass exodus. Now, you could draw conclusions along the political lines, right? And I think the way that certain states handled COVID might be part of it. But I think at the end of the day, what is important to you and what's important to somebody else are two different things. So Baltimore. I guess it was maybe it was the state. I don't know. I don't remember if it was Baltimore or the whole state. Anyway, they implemented a millionaire's tax, and this is like 12 years ago, and 85% of the millionaires left, so they had to repeal it because they're like, well, everybody's leaving, all our tax base is leaving. Yes, stupid policies will actually lead to results of people leaving the state, and we saw that during COVID, right? People wanted to live where they wanted to live, regardless of location, because they could. And that was a big driver, but also the way that some states handled COVID, the way that some states handled taxes. Some states, Massachusetts just implemented a millionaire's tax. So I'm curious as to, well, it's not really a millionaire's tax. It's if you make over $1 million in income, you pay like an extra, I forget what it was, 5 or 7% tax. So, when states start doing this, if they're by themselves, people are just going to leave. If every state does it, then that's a little different, right? But that's not going to happen. Because some states, just don't need your state, Doug, they had a surplus of tax dollars they had to give back. So every state's a little different. But I just point this out.
Just sitting around.
Yeah, but the point is there's, you have to pick a reason to live somewhere, and some people just don't want to move. Look at parts of the world where they have gunfire and they have war zones in their street. People are still living there. It could be for various reasons. Maybe they don't know how to leave, or don't feel comfortable leaving, or maybe they don't know anybody. I don't know. But everyone, it's a personal decision. So I think that's always an overlay for everything else. And I think actually Kelly's sent us some comments here. Technology's flattening the curve, which is very true. That's why a lot of people move to Lake Tahoe. I mean, it's a great location, but people started buying up houses from Silicon Valley because they figured, well, I can live here full time in a beautiful place and work. I didn't get the best of both worlds. So I love the fact that it allows people to spread out more and they're not concentrated in cities. I used to live in the city. I moved because I didn't want to live in Boston, and I love Boston. But the city was depressing. It was like zombies walking around and homeless walking around because there's no one else. It wasn't that there weren't homeless before. There were more people, and now there were just fewer people. So, I think a lot of cities are going to start to see a migration away from the city into the suburbs and the rural areas because they can. And technology is a big factor in that. And certainly, if you don't care where you live, like New York City has high taxes. You've got the state taxes, which are high. You've got the federal taxes, then you got the city taxes. There's just like piles and piles of taxes. People still live there. Why? Because you can make lots of money there. But if you could do the same thing elsewhere, like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan are like, we want people to come back to work. Why? Why do I want to come back to work when I could go live in a beautiful place and do the same work elsewhere? So to me, I think a lot of companies have some work to do to make it appealing to come back to work. And also states have some work to do to make it appealing for people to live there. Now, Massachusetts, for example, Karen just makes another comment about, someone sold $1 million condo in Boston. Yeah, I mean, people are still selling $1 million condos in Boston. The problem is they were selling at $2 million. Now maybe they're worth less. Boston is one of those resilient. It's probably the only city in the U.S. that is resilient in this way. It is the most diverse city from an economic standpoint. It gets a ton of federal money because of the colleges, because of biotech and technology and everything. There's a ton of money flowing there, and there's no new building. So it's in this really weird place where, and the politics aren't really extreme in one way. It's kind of like socially liberal, but fiscally conservative. So it kind of appeals to both parties. Both parties are a little unhappy, but they still love it enough. Good health care. So it's a really interesting city that I think it's going to be resilient. But I mean, I've seen the prices in the suburbs. The prices are crazy. And so I think across the board, real estate's going to go down. But I did want to tip it back to you because I think we can kind of talk about this all day. This is one of those heated topics, and appreciate your comments, Karen.
Yeah, let me add one thing on that too. That is a variable that's maybe not coming into the equation, and that's the aging population. For a while we had intercity boom coming from a lot of millennials and Gen Z that they didn't have families yet, and so they're working, they're living in the cities, and they are by far and away going to outnumber the aggregate of baby boomers and Gen X, right? So what happens as people get older, as they start to have kids, they tend to migrate to wanting to have a house and a place to stay and have their family. That is what kind of led to some of that suburban migration. Guess what's happening? Gen Y and Gen Z are getting older. Guess what they're starting to look for? They didn't want those houses. They didn't want to live in suburbia, but now they've got kids. So you're going to start to see potentially one of the greatest population numbers in decades or start to migrate into the suburbs, because guess what? As their economic status improves, as they start to have families, they want the same things past generations have wanted. The youth and the older, they just look at things differently.
So, yeah, I want to kind of move on here because we'll definitely be back to this because this is the huge migration's a big issue. I live in the great state of Massachusetts. I may be the only one who calls it that, but I digress. The great state of Massachusetts has a commercial funded by the state that says you can't win the lottery if you don't play. For the moment, let's ignore the fact that there's a state-sponsored commercial suggesting that you go out and spend your hard-earned money gambling on lottery tickets with odds of over 100 million to 1 of winning. But it's true, you can't win if you don't play. I'm giving you the same opportunity here in the show. The only difference is I'm not asking you to buy a lottery ticket. I'm only asking 5 to 10 minutes of your time. But I will pay you at least 100 million Zim dollars for your time. We do have some foreign listeners, so if you don't like Zim dollars, we may have some other currencies as well. If you want to earn over 100 million Zim dollars, go to www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money to get your free money today. But I want to get back to this and some of the topics we want to talk about today, because we're still in this deflation topic, which I think for a lot of people are, it's kind of a binary. It's either inflation or deflation, and we're of the opinion that it's very complicated and messy, as Doug called it, a soup yesterday. But we just had the CPI numbers out this week and the PPI numbers, and so Doug, I wanted to let you talk about it and kind of dissect it, because I think this will give a lot more detail in terms of what we were saying before with some of the new numbers that came out this week.
Yeah, well, thanks, Kirk. Sorry. There, get that mic working. Yeah, thanks. So here's the thing. Like everything that gets published in the news, Kirk, would you agree that you need to actually do a little more research than what you're being told? So we heard that. Yeah, we. What was that? Go ahead.
Every day. Always got to do more research.
Yeah. So it's being pushed that inflation slowed to only 6.4% in January. That sounds really, really good. But again, got to pull back the covers and see what's really going on there underneath them. Okay. It was 6.4%, which makes it look great compared to, a year ago when it was in the 7s. Okay. But here's the thing. It was actually 6.5% in December. So 6.4 is only 0.1% less than a month ago, but it's actually came in 0.2% higher than they anticipated. So that's not good. So even though it was only 6.4, they were actually anticipating that it would be 6.2. So they're twisting this as a significant win. But on a monthly basis, consumer prices, which is what we really care about, increased 0.5% from December. And the thing is, I've talked about this before with inflation. They make this soup, right? Lots of different things come in. Well, guess what? One of the most important ingredients you can have in food, let's just call it salt, right? Without any salt, nothing tastes good. And it's a necessary nutrient. Well, going back to the food analogy, food, which is something I don't know about you, Kirk, but I know I need it. I think it's pretty important. It was up 10.1% year to year, January to January. The 9th consecutive annual increase in that category. So that has not slowed at all. On top of that, we did have wage increases. So people are kind of celebrating that. They were up 5% over the 1 year, but that's actually down from 8% the prior year. So what we are seeing is that, once again, with inflation, the stuff that we really, really need, like food, is going up significantly. The stuff that we don't need but want, like TVs, might be starting to go down. And although wages had been keeping up, the wages started to pull back a little bit. So we've had a little bit of a break here, a schism between the rise of inflation growth or wage inflation versus the rise of food inflation. And that's going to put more pressure on families. The Fed also came in talking about doing 2 more quarter point increases, one in March, one in May. And they're looking at this as, a big, at least up until this week, the markets were feeling pretty good about these new numbers because they were thinking, all right, we'd already kind of anticipated the Fed was going to do a quarter point, in March and May. And, we priced that in. We kind of knew that was going to come. Well, I also want to say, listen, going back to the food thing, tomatoes are down 11%. That's good. So if you're into Italian food, things got a little bit easier. But new cars are up 5.8% over the last year. Used cars actually finally have come back a little bit. They were down 11.6% year over year. So there's some bright spots in here. But Kirk, I think we were talking right before this. Guess what happened? They were expecting 2 more increases of a quarter point. Now we're hearing they might be doing a half point. If you're looking at the markets, you're seeing this right now. What the markets never like, Kirk, what don't they like?
There's a lot of things
they weren't prepared for. What was that, Kirk?
I said they don't like a lot of things these days, Doug. If you look at the prices.
They don't like surprises. Yep, they don't like surprises. And if it turns out that they were anticipating 2 quarter point increases, and now we end up having a potential increase of a half point, this is, again, not going to make it easier for people to borrow. It's going to tighten up monetary policy anymore. It's going to spook the markets even more. Guys, we're not out of this yet. I mean, they're spinning it as we have this massive improvement. Everything's going away. Half truth. There's still a lot to come.
So, yeah, I want to touch on a number of those things, Doug, and I appreciate you kind of sharing that. The CPI number, it's interesting because people were expecting a 6.2%. CPI number is 6.4. So while it still was down a little bit from last month year over year, it was still higher than expected, which of course, as you said, the markets don't like. I want to mention a few things because you'd mentioned there's two more 25 basis point rate hikes in the cards. I think it was Laura Meister, one of the Fed members. I can't remember if it was her or someone else, but anyway, I saw the news today that they were talking about a 50 basis point rate hike as of this morning in the next meeting. And so the comments in the media were, well, there must be something, they must see a lot that we don't see. Like, well, of course they do. They're the ones making the rules. They see everything that we don't see. The question is whether the data we see is accurate to begin with, which I'll get into because that's another news story about Joe Biden influencing the CPI numbers to change. Now, I don't want to get into politics and get into that because I think every politician's out there trying to make themselves look better, so we won't go down that path. But the reality is, let's talk about this specifically because it's not really I don't want to tie it to Biden because I think Bush has done it and a few other people have done it. But if you look at what happened, and this started this is the first one, right? This is the first data point of the new calculations. So it was 2 years rolling. Now it's 1 year rolling. So that's going to change the calculations, right? And some people say, well, it takes a few months before it really starts to settle. I don't know. I think by July, things are going to be pretty settled because that was the peak last year. So if we're lower, it's going to show a lot lower in terms of that. So we'll have to see if things keep shrinking and that keeps going up. But I think the challenging part is, so there's a few other things that came up, and I'm trying to pull up the news story because they actually went into it. They did quite a good job this morning in laying out exactly what happened and why. So I might come back to this, but basically, if you look at the calculations, so they more heavily influenced housing. So now housing is a little bit more highly weighted in the CPI, and there's other things like food that were less highly weighted. Well, food's like 15%, and I think it went down to like 14 or something like that. But housing went from 42 to 45, I think. So effectively, what is happening, and of course, the article made it sound like the politicians deliberately did this, but a lot of this is kind of baked in for a long period of time. So some of this was, if you look back at, I'm trying to think here. So if you're looking at like housing, for example, right? Housing is going down, right? We all know it's going down. And the politicians are worried about inflation being too high. So they're saying, well, let's put something we see is going down in there. But of course, they decided this a while ago. So it's questionable as to whether that's deliberate or not. But the point is I don't know what the right amount is. I think 45 is too high. I think probably 33. If you're looking at housing, they always say, well, a third of your income or 30% should go towards housing. I think it's a reasonable cost. I mean, but of course, where else do you put it? And you've got all these other areas that you could argue whether they're true or not. But I think it's important just to recognize that inflation is complex. So I want to bring up a similar topic, which is greenflation. And I know I'm going to piss off a lot of listeners, and that's okay because if you really get triggered by this, then you're not learning anything. So hopefully you stick around to learn something. But so greenflation is a topic. It's a word I heard somewhere, and I thought it was brilliant. And the reason I thought it was brilliant is because a lot of people, when they think of climate change, global warming, saving the planet, that whole theme, right? It's not good or bad. It's just a theme, right? There's lots of themes out there. But this theme looks at the benefits without the cost. And this is a big thing that we always hear. Well, we want to save the planet. We want to clean the atmosphere. We want less carbon in the air, and we want it to be cleaner. Okay, so what are the costs, right? Everyone wants that. Everyone wants a cleaner planet. Everyone wants a cleaner environment. I don't think anyone's saying I want to be a dirty planet, right? No, everyone has the same goal. I think the question is are you looking at the cost of doing that, right? So greenflation is a cost, and this is why I bring it up. And it's inflation due to a lot of the efforts that are going into the green movement, which is, electric vehicles, less carbon emissions, stuff like that. So that impacts everything else. So for example, right now the trend is pushing gas prices higher, right? A lot of the movement and the politicians and companies are trying to do this. They're not trying to make clean energy cheaper. They're trying to make dirty energy more expensive. Think about that, right? They're not trying to solve the problem. The problem they're trying to solve is let's make everything else worse so these other things look better. Now, the problem is, if all else was equal, I could say, okay, you can make the argument you're tilting people's, buyers' expectations. I get that, right? That's a real thing that government does, right? The real reason you get deductions on your mortgage is because the government wants you to own a home. That's why you get it. Tax incentives are there to incentivize you to do certain things the government wants you to do. So there's nothing inherently wrong with it. The issue is when they do things like, well, you have clean energy cost up here, you have dirty energy down here. There's a huge margin of difference. Huge, right? So when you're saying, well, we need to make dirty energy more expensive so that people buy clean, yeah, it's more expensive, but it's still cheaper than everything else. So all you're doing is making it harder for poor people to pay their bills. And that's the problem. If it was equal, and at some point in time, it will become more equal. And that point in time will be when they start bringing on other things like nuclear energy, for example, geothermal, which people don't talk about primarily because the technology isn't great. But those are really the two solutions to, if everyone's worried about climate change, global warming and all that, whether you are or not, it's irrelevant. I think, having clean energy is probably not a bad solution, even if you don't agree, even if you don't believe in global warming and climate change. I'm not making judgments. I'm just saying, no matter what your thinking is, I think we can all agree that having cheap, clean energy is better than cheap, dirty energy. I think that's probably an agreement. But the thing is the technology is not there for geothermal, and that's probably one of the best, unless you live in a place like Japan where the crust is really thin and you can drill down and get heat coming from the core. That actually is a great way to generate energy. Now, nuclear is the best energy we could come up with that's cheap, clean, and available today. All these other technologies aren't available today. So, it's great. Everybody could drive around electric cars, but if our grid can't support that, then everybody can't drive around electric cars. So all you're doing is making gas-powered cars more expensive. So greenflation is making everything more expensive. And an example of this, you might say, well, that's just gas. I don't care. I drive an electric car. Yeah. But what do you think they transport your food in? What do you think they transport your goods in? In things that burn, carbon, whether it's trains or trucks or planes or whatever it is, it all burns dirty energy. So effectively, you're making it more expensive all the way up the supply chain, from food, from goods, housing, whatever it is. It all gets impacted by making dirty energy more expensive. So it's not just, hey, it would be a good idea so we incentivize people, which, like I said, isn't wrong. I disagree with how they go about it, but I think the underlying reason isn't, it's not unethical. It's actually a good reason. It's just how they go about it's wrong. But the point is it's bringing all of these unforeseen consequences, right? I think it was Rumsfeld who said there's the known knowns, there's the unknown knowns, or the known unknowns, and then there's the unknown unknowns. Like, this is one of those, consequences that people hopefully didn't foresee. If they did, then they're probably evil. But these are one of those consequences. You're like, well, I didn't mean to do that. Well, you did. And so a free market economy allows the real answers to come out, but when it gets manipulated by government and other parties, it tends to provide unforeseen consequences that are maybe not the best. Whereas a free market kind of sorts that out. So I think that, the inflation we're getting is coming from different places. Initially, it was the supply chain, which is, hey, we have to go from globalization to deglobalization, where now we have to pay for more for goods because we can't just get it from China, because now we're fighting with China over hot air balloons that they won't even tell us what they are if they're UFOs from China. To me, this is wacky. But the fact is China is not our best friend, and neither is Russia and a bunch of other countries. So now we need to find other place to get our goods, and that place is going to be more expensive. So it started with that, and now it's high energy prices lead to higher cost of goods. So I think we have a long road ahead of us to drop inflation. People are saying, we said this in the show, we're talking about deflation. The fact that we could get deflation this year is not because inflation's going away. It's going to be primarily because of statistics and math. Like, oh, well, it was higher and now it's lower. but it's still going up. It's just going up at, a lower pace. So if you understand like how the math goes, it could technically happen, but I don't think deflation's soon in our future, but it could happen, especially go into a deep recession. So I don't know. What are your thoughts, Doug? I just kind of want a mini rant there.
Well, I think what you're going off on about is again the ideal versus practical, right? I think we've talked about that a lot of times. So recently, there was an article that came. Well, I wouldn't say it's a recent article, but it's been regurgitated that it would take about 10,000 square kilometers, or I've also seen around 1% of the Sahara Desert. If you covered it up with solar panels, you could produce enough energy harnessed from the sun to be able to supply enough power to the rest of the planet. But that's great, except how does the United States get that energy from the middle of the Sahara Desert? Are we going to run a cable across another cable across the Atlantic? Did I not look and all of a sudden, Nikola Tesla came back to life and was able to finally harness the power of transmitting electrical energy through air current? I mean, listen, it's wonderful. But I mean, if you're going to build a cable that goes across the Atlantic, you're going to have to sheathe that cable with some insulation. Oh my gosh, that insulation is going to be made out of synthetic polymers. The panels themselves, they're made of silicon. Where are we going to get one? Now, there's plenty in the Sahara, but you got to encase that in plastics, polymers. These things wear out. These things crack. They get buried. Okay, so it's wonderful to say, look, it's all there. The ideal situation that exists out there for energy really is Iceland. Iceland's in a perfect situation. They run their, we're fighting about gas stoves here. Okay. I mean, you're going to take that away. Iceland is running their stoves off of steam. Turn on dial, bam, steam heats up the pot. They cook their food. They got steam to heat their floors. They steam to heat their houses. They steam to run their factories. It's great, but they live on an active volcano. Okay, so again, there's pros and cons to that, because all it takes is, a volcanic explosion and Iceland no longer exists, right? We don't all have that type of access. I mean, there is argument about, one of the largest calderas on the planet is Yellowstone, right? So we do have access to geothermal, but I talked to individuals from Xcel Energy years ago about this. It's not as easy to tap as people think. Well, then you get to nuclear. Nuclear's had a couple of, minor scary events and significant disastrous occurrences. But over the scheme of things, it's probably had less deaths and less impact than than we're getting out of out of car crashes every day. But we still drive cars. But nobody wants it in their backyard. And most people aren't willing to look at the opportunity because of the fears of what could happen if something goes wrong. So we turn back to looking at other sources, wind energy, solar energy. Batteries have to be used to harness that energy, because here's a problem with wind and solar. And this was an issue that's always been there. Solar energy is only good during the day. We don't have solar energy when we're on the backside of the planet at night. Wind energy tends to be much better at night. Have you ever noticed how when the sun goes down, the breeze picks up, okay, as you get that thermal convection? Guess what? Now, if you're running on one or the other, you're going to have a problem. So now you got to store it. Batteries. They don't have the battery capacity. I know there's been a lot of investment in this at this point in time to be able to harness that energy to be able to use it later. Plus, batteries are made of very, very potent toxic chemicals now, and they don't harness energy forever. Batteries eventually wear out. So now you've got waste disposal. You've got polymers that have to, and you petroleum that has to be created to use this. Then you've got the waste, and you've got the disposal, and we've got fields of places where they're burying. They don't last very long. As a matter of fact, I think I was talking about this last week or in another conversation. The current technology they're using for wind turbines has been a disaster. They've been trying to make them more effective. The new ones have been breaking down left and right, and they can't figure out how to get them to last. So great, it's wonderful. You get this field of wind turbines. Let's not get into the animal effects of it and the other takeaways, but all of a sudden you get into a situation where you have these fields of turbines, and maybe 10, 15 years in, you've got to replace them all. That's incredibly expensive. That is not what we call sustainable energy, because if you have to replace the turbine to get that energy, now you don't have sustainable, you don't have renewable, because we think about the energy being renewable, but not the way to harness it. So again, Kirk, I don't know about you. I'd love to see the planet, crash and burn, right? We all just want to see the planet all dirtied, right? No, we all want ideal, and I think you, Karen, I know we had the disaster with nuclear explosion. Well, it wasn't a nuclear explosion in Japan. It was actually the weather, where they put that nuclear plant, and based on some outdated technology, it got flooded. It had, there was a, weather disaster that caused a problem there. Ultimately, we all want to have a cleaner planet. We all agree that there's got to be a sunset to the things that dirty our planet, like you're saying there. But it's not just too easy to say, let's cut it off. Because if you cut it off without having a completely efficient and economical option to replace that, unchecked inflation. As I said before in a couple other podcasts, the leaders of Africa have come out and said, look, you want us to live in first world ideals with all this clean energy. That's not how you were able to develop your economies. If you force us to do this, we will never be able to advance. We need cheap energy now. And that's the balance that's going to have to be figured out. It's not a simple solution. Nobody wants a dirty planet, but we also don't want something that nobody can afford, that completely collapses the global economy.
So there's a lot of great points there, and I do want to bring on some people this year to talk more about nuclear, because I think it needs to get out. When you look at kind of how we came about, as you mentioned, Doug, like the reason, and there was actually a good chart I saw a few weeks ago, which I thought was brilliant, and it showed that prosperity and wealth creation have really thrived off cheap energy. It doesn't matter if it's clean or dirty, right? Just cheap energy. If all of us had abundant, cheap energy, imagine the things that we could do, right? Before we had electricity, before cars, before we started drilling for oil, and we had pretty much compressed energy in the form of oil, like things didn't progress so quickly, but now they progress a lot quicker, right? Because we have cheap energy. And so I think we have to keep in mind that if you look at economics, right? If something is cheap and plentiful, then people will use more of it, right? And they will use that energy to do other things, right? So imagine, like right now, perfect example, electric cars. Let's say we all want electric cars. Well, we can't, because we don't have cheap energy, right? We have expensive energy, and it's certainly the grid couldn't support everybody. But imagine if the grid could support everybody driving electric cars. Well, maybe we could do that. But California, we had this on the show, California 2 days in a row, one day said, in the next 5 years, everyone's going to have an electric car. And then a day later, they said, please don't charge your electric cars. The grid won't support it. And it's like, yes, I know this is one of the challenges when it comes to economics, is a free market will typically end up with the best result. Not always, right? You could argue that there's some bad parts about a free market and there needs to be oversight and all that. And I'm not going to make that argument. I'm just saying a free market is always better than a managed market. When you have a managed market, you have one or a handful of people deciding what is best. Well, that's not the best thing for me, right? How do look at the European Union. They make decisions at a high level, but the local people in some of these countries, they get shafted because it doesn't make sense for them, right? Because someone else is dictating what makes sense for them. That doesn't work. You can't do that, because you're always going to make people unhappy. But when you allow them to make their own decisions, then you're really kind of putting the decision back in their court, and they can make good or bad decisions. But, if you're looking at nuclear, right? And I want to share this. I can't remember if I shared it last week, but I read it somewhere and I thought it was brilliant. And so did you know, when they were looking at the nuclear technology for reactors, there were two choices. There's light water and there's molten salt reactors. And molten salt reactors were the better choice. Clearly, technologically, just overall the better choice. What happened? Well, this is when Richard Nixon was in office, and lo and behold, light water reactor production and manufacturing was in his state. So he said, let's, and there's actually a recording. I listened to the recording of this, like him talking about it. Of course, he recorded all his conversations like an idiot, but he recorded this, and basically the recording said, why don't you make this other state? I think it was Tennessee or something like that, somewhere over there. Why don't you make that other state disappear? Why don't you make that technology disappear? Because I want to put the jobs in my state. So the whole reason we have light water reactors is because of politics. It's not because of science. And when you think about this, this happens on a level every single day. This happens in politics every single day. This is an example of the best technology didn't win because the free market wasn't allowed to thrive. It was basically politics deciding. So if you think about like what's happened, actually, even if you combine all of the nuclear, well, I don't want to call them disasters because there's really only one and a half disasters. I'd say Chernobyl was a disaster, but Fukushima I wouldn't call it a disaster. I'd say it was a big problem, but disasters on the Chernobyl level is a whole different thing. But we had 3 Mile Island. I mean, there's been issues over the years. There have been more issues in industrial accidents for other forms of energy creation and manufacturing. Those happen all the time. Perfect example. We just had a train wreck in, where is it, Pennsylvania, and all this hazardous chemicals spilled all over the neighborhood and the gas spilled everywhere. Does that mean we stop shipping this stuff by rail? Well, maybe we should. I don't know, but I doubt we're going to stop that. It was barely even in the news. But yet one thing happened in Fukushima and all of a sudden, we need to get rid of nuclear energy. Nuclear energy, granted, there's problems with everything. I'm not saying it's like a perfect solution. It's the best solution we have, right? And there actually are other generation reactors which are much, much better than the light water reactors anyway, and they're virtually impossible to melt down. But no one's talking about it. No one's even looking at it. There are private parties that are looking at it. But there are people like Bill Gates who are investing in some of it, and there's definitely some other people who are investing just waiting for things to turn. But look, it's what we talked about earlier. Every outcome has consequences. If you want something, it has consequences. What are the acceptable consequences? If you want a cleaner planet, then you have to accept some consequences for something else. If you want to get there quicker, either the consequences are you're gonna make it unaffordable for poor people to feed their families. That's one consequence if you push, dirty energy higher, quicker. Or the other consequence is you can't drive your car more than 1 day a week because our electric grid doesn't support it, right? That's a consequence. But the point is you have to have conversations based around risk and reward, right? What are the consequences you're willing to accept for this outcome? And if you're not having that conversation, then it's not a discussion, an economic discussion. It's politically based, and it's really more, if you think about these religions, these zealots, it really falls into that camp. It's not economics, and it's not science. And I think if we get back to that place, we can get good outcomes. But until you get there, it's really just politics and people demanding other people do things and power. That's all it is. And it's too bad because there are a lot of people who are struggling, and they're going to struggle more with inflation. You can blame the corporations all you want. You could, and this is Karen, I appreciate all your comments. So I'm gonna pick on you a little bit because you're putting in such great comments. So it's not you, but I think your comments reflect a lot of thoughts that other people think. And I wanted to raise this point, and I'll give it back to Doug again. So there's this concept of the now I can't even speak. The excess profit tax. That's what I'm thinking of. So these politicians get up there. Well, these oil companies are making too much money. They need excess profits tax. We need to tax all their stuff. Well, you know why they have excess profits? I'll tell you why. Because the politicians have, in no uncertain terms, have said, we want you to get out of dirty energy. And the board, some of these companies have a few board members on that have been, let's just say, adversely affecting their stock, saying, well, you should, ExxonMobil, you should get out of oil and gas. Yeah, but that's what we do. Yeah, but you need to get out of that. Like, okay, well, maybe over the next 40 years I can, but I'm literally an oil and gas company. So if you want me to get out of that and go bankrupt, that's kind of stupid as a corporate shareholder, right? So if you think about these companies, right, their job, if you're drilling for oil or gas, right, your job is put down a well, pull the stuff up, and sell it, and take some of those profits, go drill another well, pull some stuff up, and sell it over and over and over again. And they've been doing it so long that they have a really good system in place to generate a certain amount of profit, right? Every year, I'm making these numbers up because I don't have them in front of me. Every year, 20% of profits go into CapEx, and CapEx is basically just reinvesting into new wells in this example. So every year, 20% of profits go into CapEx. Great. Okay, you got new wells. So that's not profit, right? It's going back into the company, it's reinvesting in the company so that in future years, they can continue to generate more profits. And over time, if they find opportunities, they'll keep growing and growing. Now, if politicians say you can't drill new wells, well, you got that 20% that you put into wells. Where do you put that? I don't know. If they don't have a solution, that goes back to shareholders in the form of dividends or the company, they pad their pockets, whatever it is. The point is they got that 20% not because they made excess profits. They got that 20% because it's not being reinvested back into future wells, which leads us to the biggest problem that we're going to see in probably the next 5 to 10 years. That lack of drilling of new wells is what's going to cause oil and gas prices to go through the roof because there's going to be a lack of supply and the demand is only increasing every single year. So that disparity is going to cause a huge problem. Now, wealthy people aren't going to worry about it because, what's an extra few bucks in my gas tank? People who can barely feed their families, they're going to be rioting in the streets. I can't drive myself to work, right? And if there's no other solution, what do you do, right? I mean, great, you can walk to work. You're going to walk 20 miles to work every day? Probably not. Maybe there's public transportation, but only if you live in a city. If you don't live in the city, there isn't. So it's not a simple problem that is solved by just unicorns and rainbows. It's just not. These are all hard decisions that require people to make those hard decisions, but also to assess what they're giving up. What are you willing to sacrifice in the name of this thing? So an oil company, for example, and I'll end it here. If an oil company is getting quote unquote excess profits, and I've heard them stop talking about this, which is probably a good thing. If you hear these oil companies getting excess profits, where were the people saying excess profits when these oil companies were just scraping by and their margins were zero or they weren't making any profit? What about in was it March, April of 2020 when the futures prices went to like negative $15 or something like that? I mean, that was an anomaly, but the point is, where were people screaming about what we need to give these oil companies more profits when they were basically not making money? They were basically, taking it on the chin because they knew later they would come back. You're in a commodity business. You make money. You make more money when it goes up. You make less when it goes down. That's just the nature of it. Oil has not gone up proportionally with inflation with everything else. Real estate has far exceeded oil prices over the last few decades. I'm not saying it should. I'm just saying it has because we have better technology. We're able to get more out of the wells. These companies have become more efficient. So all these things are factors that come into play. And I think if you're looking at one side of the equation, you never really see everything. And it'd be nice to think that in 20 years, we're going to have cheap, clean energy. Everyone's going to be riding on autonomous cars and they won't have to own their own cars, which is a whole nother philosophical debate. But it's nice to think that, but that's not today, right? That's 10, 20 years from now. And if we're working towards that, that's fine. But you can't leave poor people behind for the greater good because the poor people aren't going to be brought along. And frankly, as times get harder, that percentage of poor people is going to grow and grow. So you might have 5% of the country that doesn't care. 95% of the country is going to be really pissed. So you're never going to get to that end up state if you can't bring everybody along with you because they won't let it happen. They're going to yell and scream, vote people out of office, and then the politicians are going to run scared and they're going to say, screw this green stuff because I want to get reelected. So you can't just screw over people for the sake of other people. You have to think of it in a holistic way. And unfortunately, both parties can't agree on anything because they'd rather just fight over the problem rather than coming up with a solution. I can't wait for the day we have a politician who says, here's a solution and makes it happen because I haven't seen them. So we got about 7 minutes, Doug. So I don't know if you got some final thoughts before we wrap it up.
Yeah, well, one thing I wanted to at least quickly talk about is, again, we talk about those profits. And one thing people don't understand, if you go look at gas prices, the one thing that has consistently increased in gas prices is actually taxes. Taxes are the excise taxes. Every time states are looking for more revenue, the first thing they want to look at is where do I put that on something we consider to be a sin, right? So they throw it on things like gasoline and cigarettes and alcohol. So if you want to look at where the biggest increases in oil have been, it's not profit to the oil companies. It's actually been the taxes that they take at the tank. You were talking about the actual price. Oil has not gone up in price at all, adjusted for inflation, since 1973. Okay. Before 1973, which again, I think, Kirk, that was a supply and demand issue, if I'm not mistaken. That was the embargoes that we were running into. Oil before, just for inflation, before 1973 actually had been around $25 to $30 a barrel. It spiked up to about $64 a barrel in 1974, rising to a high of $140 a barrel, $144 a barrel before it declined. And through the 80s, it was back into about the 40 to 60 range. And yes, early 2000s, we all kind of know what was happening prior to the Great Recession. It got up to $191 a barrel. And what did they talk about? We're running out of oil, right? And for whatever reason, that price got up to $191. But guess what? The recession took that down, and it dropped back down to about $70 a barrel, right back to where we were in 1974. And then it climbed again to about 120, and then it dipped in 2016 down to about 42. It went even worse because of COVID. It went down to as low as, $23 a barrel. That's what it was, adjusted for inflation. As that was lower than it had been since 1945. We're currently sitting right around $78, $80 a barrel. That's nothing. That's the same place we were sitting in 1990. The price of energy hasn't gone up. It's not like they're sitting there jacking the prices of oil and taking profits. They really haven't. Like Kirk said, they just haven't. You've taken away their ability to deploy it. You've taken away their incentive to deploy it. And you've also taken away the supply, which leads to supply and demand inequities. I agree with everything that's being stated. They're carrying a lot of things. What you're talking about are exactly the ideals we agree with, that there needs to be a better philosophy and solution for cleaning this planet. There needs to be better sources of energy. But unfortunately, trying to get there and trying to mandate it with a dead stop has never worked in any circumstance in the history of the economy without creating collateral damage. And that's I'm not saying if it works, it's great. Awesome. I hope it works. I hope it gets there. They're trying new technologies, battery power, sodium. Not only are they looking at sodium on nuclear, but they're also looking at sodium on batteries. And if we can get that, then we don't have to worry about lithium anymore, and it's clean, and these batteries last, and we can store the energy. Awesome. I hope that technology continues. But if that technology is not ready by the time we mandate a deadline, which they have now done in California, and by the way, in Minnesota, where I'm at, they've done the same thing, and we cross that date, they're going to have to make some hard decisions, because if they stick their heads in the sand and say, as of this date, we know change, everybody's done, we're not going to change, everybody's done, and we don't have the technology there to support it, then the affordability, it will actually, and unfortunately, guess who it's going to hurt? You talked about the urban centers. It's going to hurt the people on the bottom end of the economic spectrum, the ones that are struggling to get by already. The ones that are sitting there going, look, I need to buy a cheap beater that might cost me $5,000 and it might be a gas guzzler, but I can't afford a $55,000, $100,000 Tesla. I just can't do it. So guess what? Now they can't get a car. They can't afford the gas. They can't afford to heat their homes. And guess who it's hurt again? Not the wealthy. It's hurt those that actually are pinching pennies the most. So again, I think we're all on the same page with the outcome. It's just how to get there. There has to be a little more give and take. But we know, unfortunately, Kirk, in this political spectrum, it's either give or take. And I think that's the challenge we're running into, is just not a lot of work in the trenches to actually get along and find a solution that's going to be easily evolved over time. It's, I want this and I want it now. So, all right, a little bit more about me. I know we're wrapping up on time, Kirk, so I can tell you where to find me. If you are a business owner and trying to run your business more effectively, and of course, as Karen has talked about in this, We are looking for ways in which those businesses can look out for their people, run better in the economy, better work-life balance. A business is not stressed will ultimately allow for a better opportunity for their employees, right? A lot of the stress that comes with businesses is the pressure that's put on them because everybody's trying to work hard to make this business thrive. We've got a lot of obstacles. If you're a business owner and you want to get your business to work without you, to thrive more effectively and efficiently for yourself, for your employees, etc., learn how to do that. Learn how the business doesn't own you, and you can own your business. There's a 9-step method. We actually have an 8-step business growth guide that you can download for free at automaticbusinessmethod.com in as little as 90 days. It costs money to get help, but in 90 days, you can boost your revenue, create a business performance culture that will help your customers and your employees, and get your time back so you can live life on your own terms. Download this cheat sheet at automaticbusinessmethod.com.
Great. Well, Doug, I really appreciate you coming on the show this week, as always. And I just wanted to leave with one point. I figure by next week this will be old news, but I've been doing a lot with a research on ChatGPT. As you know, a few weeks ago we did an episode on this and AI, and I thought it was really interesting. And of course, ironically, Doug was having tech issues, and so was I. So for a technology issue, I thought it was extremely ironic. But anyway, so I just wanted to point this out because I got a good laugh today in how basically Bing, which is the first to incorporate ChatGPT into its technology, and people are testing it, and literally it is gaslighting them. It is lying to them, gaslighting them. It is, I mean, you see this stuff and it's scary. And I only point this out not to beat up on it because, you know, there's a big learning curve here. But, you know, the point is I want to point this out because a lot of things we talk about in the show are perspective and narratives, right? Now, the perspective is if you're on Twitter, you're going to get fire hosed with trolls. Like you should expect that, right? And anything you learn, anything you hear in there is probably not going to be true, right? But if you hear it from like Warren Buffett, it's probably more likely to be true, right? I'm sure he's got his own PR department. But anyway, it's more likely to be true as somebody who's more reputable. But if you look at something like AI or ChatGPT, you see what's happening. It's literally, I mean, I would encourage all of you to Google or Bing or whatever you use for search engine, but because I guess Bing right now is not using it, they're just beta testing it with certain people. But use a search engine and go and find, basically Bing gaslighting users or something along those lines. And you're going to see examples of a bunch of people just showing screenshots and saying, here's what it's happening. It's yelling at people, it's telling them they're liars. And then, you say that the answer is wrong and it'll go and make something up. Like the point I'm making is the perspective is going to be really weird going forward because how are you going to know if what it's telling you is true or not? That's a scary aspect. If it's mostly true, right? We talk about half truths. If it's half true, it's true most of the time. And then once in a while it throws in a little like, oh, we wanted to say this. That's like social media gone wrong, right? We all saw the Netflix documentaries on what social media is doing to us and what it did during the elections. And this is going to be potentially worse because someone is programming this, and that someone is a person with their own biases, and what that bias says and what is allowed and not allowed is a scary prospect. So I would recommend everybody go research that so you can get a perspective on what is going on with AI now. And I'm not crapping all over AI because it really is going to be transformative in many ways. But I think if you're using it to color your perspective on life, it's a scary thing because I think a lot of people are going to do that. And it's very easily, and if you see how it runs, it actually tries to be your friend. So, I think the persuasion is off the charts on this thing. So you got to be really careful, especially around kids, because this thing could be really dangerous. But it could also change the world in the same way. So I just want to point that out there because it's important with new technology to look at the benefits and the consequences, which we talked about in the show today. That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us on Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name's Kirk Chisholm, wealth manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on this show. You can also check out our show at Money Tree Investing Podcast. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Please remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel for immediate access to the new shows when they're released. When you subscribe to the show, it allows us to get access to some of the top minds of investing in personal finance. While you're here, please leave a comment and question if you want us to address it on the show. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.